Welcome back to the Mina Kimes Show featuring Lenny, the only NFL podcast where one of the hosts thinks running back is just another word for fetch. That's Lenny. I'm Mina Kimes. He actually doesn't fetch something and run back. He fetches something and then keeps going with it and runs away from me. So he hasn't really grasped the concept yet. But he, like me, is very excited about today's guest. It's been a long time. Diante Lee from The Athletic. Diante, welcome back to the show.
Thank you for having me. I feel like every time I'm here, it's a new publication or I'm doing something else with my career. So I'm glad to be back again.
I actually don't remember if you last time you were on.
I think it was, I know the first time was PFF because I think I came on with Seth.
That's right.
And then Athletic the last couple of times. So hopefully I'm someplace where I can be here for a little while.
Well, you do a great job for The Athletic. You've been all over the draft. I asked you to come on specifically to talk about the top defensive prospects in the draft. Last week, Derek Klass and I talked about the offensive guys. The week before, if you guys want to check it out, GT O'Sullivan and I talked about the quarterback prospects. And then next week is draft week, so I'm going to do a mock draft. I do what I would do, not what I think the teams will do. But I actually want to start off by talking about a couple of teams who have a lot of smoke around them before we get to the prospects. I also want to talk about the Jalen Hurts contract. Not a ton to talk about there, honestly. But first, I want to talk about these teams, specifically the Texans and the 49ers. And we can start with the 49ers because today, I can't remember. Pro Football Talk is where I saw it. I apologize if it originated somewhere else, but there are rumors, not entirely surprising ones, by the way, that these San Francisco 49ers are fielding offers, not seeking out fielding, for one Trey Lance, who actually, I think not Derek and I, whoever I had on before JT and I got into this and talked about it at length because there was this was kind of percolating a little bit. Now I remember the last piece of news that I responded to was Kyle Shanahan and John Lynch coming out and basically saying Brock Purdy is our starter.
Right, he's the guy.
So that kind of set the table for today's news, right? Because the Niners came out and said, yeah, it's Purdy. And then Sam Darnold, who we went out and signed, and Trey Lance can duke it out.
Right.
Which was a surprisingly, I was surprising not just because, of course, a mere couple of years ago, the Niners traded the farm to move up and get Trey Lance with pick number 3. He's barely played football for them. First year redshirting, second year injured.
Right.
But also was so definitive to say in March. So anyways, this latest piece of news also had Florio threw out one of the teams, the Vikings, talking to the Niners at the Combine. What's your reaction to, I guess, the idea that the Niners might trade Trey Lance?
It opens up so many more questions for me. Like, I don't know. I'm having a really hard time wrapping my mind around what a Trey Lance transaction looks like. I was talking to some of my colleagues, and one of the things we keep coming back to is whatever it is that you might think about Trey Lance as a prospect, what his ceiling might be. We're talking about a guy that has 5 starts between college and pros basically over the last 3-4 years. So we have no idea. We don't have enough of a sample size period to really be able to get a clear picture on what kind of quarterback he is, which leads me to, I think, the bigger question of what is the package that gets it done? Yeah. This is someone who cost 3 first-round picks for the Niners. Their roster building now through the draft is dramatically different because of the transactions that they've made to go get him, and then obviously Christian McCaffrey this last season. So I don't know what it is that you ask for back. I'm sure they would like to get a 1, but you're not trading a 1 for a guy that basically has not logged a meaningful snap in the NFL. So that's kind of the thing I have a hard time wrapping my mind around. As far as a team like the Vikings, that makes a lot of sense, right? I can understand them saying we'd rather do that than pay whatever the exorbitant fee it is to get from late in the first round into the range that it takes to get one of the quarterbacks if they happen to like one of the top 4 guys that we've been talking about throughout this entire pre-draft process. But outside of that, I just have a really hard time wrapping my mind around what this means for San Francisco and why they're so definitive when their quote-unquote starter that's going to be coming back probably won't be back until late fall, early winter, most optimistically. I don't get it.
It's hard for me to know how to value Lance, but I think we can say definitively that his value has diminished since the Niners traded up for him. And that, this is going to be, if a trade were to happen, basically any scenario other than him coming back, competing, winning the job, and being the dude is an L for San Francisco, because they gave up way more than they're going to, even when you consider time and whatever they get back. It's hard for me to imagine a team trading a first. And I say that as someone who believes we don't know who Trey Lance is as a quarterback. This is what I said last time I talked about him. Dude's barely played. Most of it seems like most people's opinions are just based on inference. Oh, the Niners don't like him, so he must suck. Well, we don't know. Right? We don't know. I guess what I find a little bit confusing, or I guess potentially thorny, is, and you alluded to this, we're coming off of a playoffs where the Niners were down to Brock Purdy throwing with the wrong hand.
Right.
Yes.
End around passes.
Yeah. They were down. They did not have any quarterbacks left, right? Yes, they go out and they sign Sam Darnold, but if you trade Trey Lance, you're comfortable with that quarterback room? With Brock Purdy coming off of the UCL injury with an uncertain timeline that the coach and the GM have given different accountings of?
Right.
And Sam Darnold?
Who's perpetually dinged up because he's always getting hit hard?
That is, especially considering the Niners' realistic playoff aspirations because of how good the roster is. That is surprising to me. And that's what makes me think, unless I think if you can get a good return, I get it, right? Because essentially, let's say a team is willing to trade, I don't know, a couple seconds. Right. I kind of don't think that's going to happen, but whatever. Let's say that's the Vikings. I can see the Niners saying, okay, essentially all we need Lance for at this point is depth because we're so out on him, or a guy to, compete with Darnold or maybe whatever. So we'll take a couple seconds. We'll draft a guy. We'll bring in a body. Maybe there's a veteran out there or whatever. I think Teddy's still out there, actually, now I think about it. Speaking of injured quarterbacks. But yeah, so I could see them saying, listen, we already gotten hosed on this, or not hosed, our own volition, whatever. We're taking the L. If we can get a decent draft haul, that's more valuable than quarterback depth.
Right.
But that's presuming, A, that they can get that, and B, that is all they view him now as depth, which is wild.
3 first rounds. 3 first round picks is what it costs to get a guy that you're trying to get off of before the end of his rookie deal. It's that's the thing that's just it's mind boggling. And to me, I think a lot of this comes back to what I've been focusing on, which is the messaging, right? Being so definitive about Purdy, and then having this come out. I love the clarification to start with, we're not making the calls, we're not dialing the numbers, but if it rings, we would not be doing our job to not answer. But the fact that this is public for them and you haven't seen any definitive or, smoke screens, we're not even thinking about this, we want them to compete for the job. That to me tells me that they must not think that they can reclaim this, which either that or they believe they're going to get major surplus value back for them. And I don't see that world existing. So if I had to pick one or the other, I would think the former. I would be shocked if it's the latter. We'll
see what happens. I agree with you, by the way. Vikings makes a ton of sense. A team that's been linked to Hendon Hooker, or there's a few teams picking later, I don't know, the Bucks, maybe I'll throw out there. The Titans, if they decide to pass on quarterback at 11, or, aren't interested in the first round. That's another team where I could see a second or a third wanting to take a shot at it. But yeah,
I was Baltimore even. I might think about if I can throw maybe a late top 100 pick to get a guy like that. I know I've got the tag on what I think is my franchise quarterback, but if he doesn't show up, maybe we just give this to Lance for a little bit and see what happens.
I mean, any team trading a top, like what you said, I don't know, late second. I love that for any team that does the trade because of the potential, and that's to take a shot at a quarterback. Generally, I feel this way too. Most teams, teams in last year's draft. All right, well, that's that. The other piece of draft-related gossip, rumors, speculation I want to talk to you about is the growing murmur that the Houston Texans are not taking quarterback at pick number 2. So I was actually on NFL Live with Adam Schefter when he and my colleague Dan Orlovsky kind of went back and forth about this, and they ended up making like a bet on air where Adam was like, yeah, I don't think, we were talking about the Colts, and he was like, yeah, I don't think they're worried. They think that they're going to take, like, essentially 2 quarterbacks will go in the top 4 instead of, I mean, there's been rumors of 3, 4. Everybody assumed up to this point that Carolina would take a quarterback, Houston would take a quarterback, potentially a team would trade up to 3 with Arizona, and then the Colts would take a quarterback. If Houston passes on a quarterback, all draft scenarios go out the window. Yes. The Arizona pick suddenly becomes very different. Indianapolis suddenly has their pick of guys, whatever. Before we get into that, I guess from Houston's perspective,
right?
What's your take on the notion that they're going to not only pass on the quarterback this year? I think this is notable. There aren't rumors about them getting like the mother load.
Right.
That would be one thing, right? If you were like, oh, Houston, they suck. They need to fill out this roster. Tennessee's going to trade up. They're going to get multiple firsts next year. That's not what the buzz is. The buzz is just that they're taking Will Anderson at 2. So how do you feel about that?
Another thing that I don't think makes a lot of sense to me. I'm not 2 and 2 is not equaling 4 here. And you alluded to it. If what Adam Schefter's reporting if it was, hey, the Colts feel like the tiers between the top 3 quarterbacks on their board is close enough that they feel comfortable that they'll all be on the board. The inference there is that Arizona doesn't have a market for the number 3 pick the way that they would like for it to be. They're just going to take what's available. I think that plenty of people can envision that. For it to be, the Colts feel very positive about where they stand right now because neither of the teams ahead of them outside of Carolina is looking to take a quarterback. That was the thing that kind of had my eyebrows up at my hairline. I don't understand from Houston's perspective, if there was a quarterback that they liked. I was listening to my friend Ben Solak on the Ringer show, and they were kind of throwing around the idea of maybe it's Will Levis for them and they feel comfortable with taking a guy at 2 and then maybe trading up from 12 or letting it play out. That's bad draft strategy.
If y'all don't like a quarterback enough to take them at 2, but you want to take him just a little bit later in the first round, he's not your quarterback.
He's not your quarterback. Okay. And you're probably setting him up for failure. So that was the argument they were making, and I agree with that. From Houston's perspective, the only way you don't take a quarterback at 2, knowing that there's only one you're not going to have access to, is that you would be trading down, I would think. And that's not to say there's anything wrong with Will Anderson. That's not to say there would have been anything wrong with Jalen Carter if he was a pick. That's not to say there would be anything wrong with them deciding, for as much as they like Titus Howard, they want to go get one of the top tackles or something to that effect. I could see a world where you can do something else with that, but that should come after trying to trade down from 2, which you've heard no scuttlebutt from, nothing from Ian Rappaport, nothing from Adam Schefter, nothing from, Houston beat reporters. It just sounds like they've resigned themselves to the fact that we couldn't get Bryce Young and we really wanted Bryce Young, so I guess Will Anderson is just what it is.
We're going to talk about Will Anderson at length today. I love Will Anderson. I don't view him as like Myles Garrett. I'll just say that right now before we get into it. And so, it is... I mean,
it's a hell of a situation to walk into if you're D'Amico Ryans.
Put yourself in the shoes of a Texans fan. Mm-hmm. On one hand, logically, you could say, okay, maybe the quarterbacks are overrated. We really could use a stud edge rusher. Maybe D'Amico, who is very smart, views Will Anderson as his Bosa or whatever, And we clearly need to build. This roster is not ready. Then we're going to be bad. So next year, we get a shot at Drake May or Caleb Williams.
Right.
Logically, you can make that case.
You can shoehorn, you can shoehorn the logic to make it.
If you had another first rounder next year through an actual trade to go up, whatever, in case you need it. Mm-hmm. But also, put yourself in the shoes of a Texans fan.
Yes.
You did the Davis Mills thing for a year until the waning seconds of the 2022 season. You had the number 1 draft pick.
Yes.
And now your organization is like, hey guys, remember the offense you watched last year? Gotta watch it again. I mean,
Yeah,
I
would
guess
you
we got a
like
new
it
offensive
again?
coordinator. It's not even like they went out and traded for Garoppolo or
Right.
Brissett, or it's literally going to be the same thing, right? Like,
Yeah.
I just think that's such a hard sell. And also, by the way, if it plays out the way we've discussed, where let's say you there's no trades. So let's say it turns out people like the quarterbacks less than we thought.
Mm-hmm.
So they get Will Anderson. Let's say the Cardinals don't have a trade either. They get Jalen Carter. Your division rival
is about to get what
has
they
their
believe is
pick
a franchise quarterback.
of quarterbacks, and you didn't like them, but God knows teams aren't great. We just talked about Trey Lance at forecasting quarterbacks. So there's a good chance that CJ Stroud, Anthony Richardson, Little Levis, whatever, is going to terrorize you like for a decade. And so you got to sit on the sidelines and watch like a potentially exciting rookie season. It's just a hard sell for me.
It's more than a hard sell. The scenario that you're painting, if it goes poorly, is what gets people fired in 2 years. Like, if this plays out the way that we're describing, let's say Indianapolis does get CJ Stroud, and he's a hit, and in a season and a half, it looks like the Colts are ready to compete with the Jaguars at the top of the division. Nobody gets to keep their job after that. Those are the kinds of mistakes that are hard to survive. So I'm like really fascinated, like tied to this with the fact that we've got all these public comments from Nick Caserio, like, my job is fine. I'm not going anywhere.
Where is this
Everything's
confidence
good.
coming from?
And I'm like, wait a second. I don't know if you've earned that yet. Like, what the last public reporting we have on you was all the mess with you and Jack Easterby before he left the organization. So I don't think that you've done enough for you to feel like, your feet are firmly planted within this organization. So on many levels, if I'm D'Amico Ryans, assuming that this is a decision made above him, I'm throwing a fit in my office every single day until somebody's mind changes.
Assuming. I don't know, man. If they take a defensive stud, it's entirely possible that Ryans was involved. All right, that's the Texans. I'm trying to be very circumspect about everything because this draft seems like total chaos based on, like, every day there's a new rumor. Suddenly Levis is QB2 after sliding down boards. Right. 4 QBs are going, no QBs are going. Who the heck knows what's going to happen? So we'll see. One more thing I want to talk about. This is going to be a very long podcast, by the way, before we get to the defensive players, and that is Jalen Hurts. You see the numbers: 5 years, $255 million. 110 of that are guaranteed.
Right.
With him, because he was not a first-round draft pick, new money is what you're looking at. And TLDR, it's a very normal quarterback contract.
Right.
So I guess first I want to talk about just the Hurts and Eagles side of this. Inevitable, I think, after his season. I would say more than his season, actually his performance in the Super Bowl is kind of what sealed this for me, because even until then, there's still kind of, how much of this is really Jalen Hurts? The offense is amazing. The offensive line is like the best in football, all reasonable. Although, so much of what they do is because of Jalen Hurts, especially on the ground. Then he goes out in the Super Bowl and he just bowls out of his mind. And that kind of sealed it for me. I was like, all right, they're going to do the deal. They do the deal. I guess I don't have any real, kind of had to get done. I don't think. He did get a no trade clause, which I thought was kind of fascinating after the whole, they did an early extension with Carson Wentz, which of course horribly backfired on them. Do you have any, just again, from the Eagles side of this, does this surprise you in any way? Do you agree with it? Do you have any qualms, or does it just feel about inevitable?
I guess it feels about inevitable when you look at everything in the aggregate, right? Like, at first I saw the number, the length of the contract, the guarantees, and I think me, naturally, as an Eagles fan, the first thing I think about is Carson Wentz. I'm like, the last bet didn't go so well. I don't know how I feel about it. Then you see the numbers, like the cap hits over the first 4 years. And it's like, okay, that's more than manageable. And that tells me that you guys genuinely believe that you can hold this roster together long enough to make multiple runs at it. And that you feel like you guys are the class of the NFC East and you're safe, in your space in the NFC, which is, I think, a sound logic to have. I think that there will be first or second just about every year of this deal, considering, again, assuming that things don't completely fall apart. So once I got over that initial kind of like wincing, no pun intended, and looking at the numbers of it, the other thing I went back to, it's kind of like some of the messaging that was out in Philadelphia basically throughout this entire process, because it always sounded like Jeffrey Lurie and Howie Roseman believed in him. And I think that it was really more of a matter of however he performs in 2022 is what's going to dictate the number, but we are not necessarily concerned that we'll have to be right back in the quarterback market after, which left me feeling like however I feel about this contract or this quarterback is really more about me than it is about the actual situation in Philadelphia. Like, my concerns is really just like, what does the trajectory look like for Hurts? So if 2022 is the best version that we ever see from the guy, and that's just who he is, or that's kind of like the baseline of it, you're probably happy with that.
Yes.
I think that you'd be happy with that. I don't think that it's like some gargantuan overpay. Even the springing guarantees in the deal brings you basically up to the Josh Allen level, which is like, okay, you're kind of rich. You know, it's a little rich for the quarterback that he is, but it's also the quarterback market. It's not like getting a quarterback better than Hurts would cost you less. So, you know, from that perspective, roster building wise, the way that they're managing the money based on what's reported, and the fact that he did come out in 2022 and ball out, and I think that the supporting cast around him, save for some of the role players on defense, is basically intact. I have reason to believe that Philadelphia can genuinely contend to the degree that you believe that there is a window to contend in the NFL.
Yeah. We talked about it on live, and I think that's the question that came up. Like, oh no, like how much hard? Well, yeah, it's harder for every team that doesn't have a rookie quarterback. Some teams do a better job of it than others. They just played a team. They lost to a team in the Super Bowl that appears to have done a really good job building around the Patrick Mahomes contract, whether it was trading Tyreek Hill, hitting on draft picks, you know. And actually, that is kind of an interesting point, because the Chiefs and the Eagles stand in really stark contrast in that respect.
Yes.
The Eagles basically played none of their rookies last year. And whether that was because of the defensive depth or because of how they view the rookies, well, we certainly don't know with Dean, because he Nakobe Dean barely played.
Barely played, right.
Jordan Davis saw the field some and was useful, but I think you're going to want him to be more productive.
Right.
But then you had the Chiefs, on the other hand, who played like the most rookies of any team other than like the Bears and Texans, I think. But a lot of their young defensive backs in particular, all their rookies contributed. But those guys, I thought, had a lot to be excited about, or did a lot to be excited about. The Eagles are now going to have to do that, basically.
Yes.
Like that's
number 10 and number 30 have to
be
hits for them this year. And next year's first round pick probably has to be a hit for them as well. Like, I think all their top 60 picks over the next 3 years, I think that they've got to hit and get guys that can play right now. They're not going to have the benefit of doing the whole redshirting all of our rookie class the way that they did last year.
And, you know, like that's, again, just how it is.
That's a regular NFL,
That's just how it is in the NFL. As you mentioned, the offense is largely intact too, which I think next year will be helpful, especially with Shane Steichen gone. The only other angle on this I think that's worth hitting is kind of what it means for the other quarterbacks. I guess the other win for the Eagles is that they got it done early, because it seems inevitable that Justin Herbert and Joe Burrow's deals will both be bigger in some ways. I'll be curious to see the years on them, because if I was Burrow, for example, and maybe my, you know, cheap, sorry, Bengals, organization isn't giving me as much of a bump as I deserve, I might say, all right, let's do 4 years.
Exactly.
Let's see, you know, because Hurts, you could argue the 5 years was a concession for Philadelphia too. I expect those deals to get done. I expect them to be pretty normal. The big question, as ever, is Lamar Jackson.
Right.
The way I see it, this is not good for him. Well, it's kind of good and not good depending on his willingness to just take a normal deal. If he's willing to do a normal deal at this point, it's good, because it's another data point. He can say, all right, I want to make more than the longer he drags this out, the higher his price tag, if he's willing to do a normal deal.
Right.
If he's not, this is bad, because it's yet another example of a normal quarterback contract and more evidence that the Deshaun Watson deal was an aberration.
And that was my first reaction, is like, all right, the NFL has now decided on multiple occasions that's never happening again. So it just, from that perspective, from a negotiating perspective for Lamar Jackson, I think that is a reality that has to be faced. If he was going to do a guaranteed deal, it would probably be more in the line of like the Kirk Cousins deal a few years ago, where it's like, 2-3 years. The number's probably not going to be as high as a typical free agent quarterback might be, but we will fully guarantee the deal. I don't know, and it doesn't sound like that's something that interests him. And it wouldn't interest me if I was a quarterback who, ran a lot and took a lot of hits, and I got to be the engine of the running game and the passing game. I would want long term. So like you said, if he's able to look at this and approach it as rationally as possible, you can walk right into the Ravens office and say, hey, that's very similar to the deal that was reportedly offered to Lamar, assuming that was true. He took that. I'm better than this guy. I'm more accomplished than this player, and the market dictates that the next guy is going to reset the market anyways on this, or take a step above who the last guy was. That will make a lot of sense. It's just like you said with Herbert and Burrow. He can use those deals as templates, because I would assume that both teams are going to look to want to lock these guys up for 6-7 year deals. Maybe Lamar doesn't get something to that extent, but you can take some of the figures there and apply that to your deal. And then the big thing I think you can take, and you alluded to it, is a no trade clause. That would be my big sticking point if I'm Lamar now. Maybe I'll bend on the money, but I got to get a no trade clause, because if there is something wrong with my body long term, I want to make sure that I'm protected as much as you can be long term.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. I do think the reporting around it was that he was offered 133 fully guaranteed, which is much more than the Jalen deal, if that's accurate. When he said no 133, he meant he wasn't. My interpretation was not that he was disputing that number, but he was disputing some people's interpretation of the total offer. Yeah, what are guarantees or whatever. So, anyways, we'll see. All right. That's Jalen Hurts. That's the quarterback contracts. We're finally ready to talk about what you're here to talk about today, and that is defensive players. We kind of got started with Will Anderson. So I want to start with the edge rushers. And the way I sent you the names that I wanted to talk about. So I have it. This is my perception. I have Will Anderson in a tier of his own.
Yep.
And then I go, Tyree Wilson is pretty definitively my number 2. And then I've got the next couple of tiers of guys who are likely to go in the first round. Myles Murphy, Nolan Smith, sounds like Lukas Van Ness.
Right.
So not everybody agrees about Tyree Wilson. I actually think he, maybe other than Anthony Richardson on offense, or Quentin Johnston, maybe.
Yeah.
Tyree Wilson seems to be the most polarizing prospect in the draft. So put a pin in that. Mm-hmm. Will Anderson, I guess we should start where I kind of, I feel bad starting this way, but I said I don't view him as Myles Garrett. I think he's really great. Like, I have joked about how over the moon I would be if he somehow fell to Seattle at 5. I mean, I think he's kind of good at everything. He is not like he is incredibly athletic. His first step is tremendous.
Yes.
He's explosive. His closing speed is incredible. His flexibility is okay, but he's strong.
Right.
He's still developing his repertoire, but you see glimpses of it. At Alabama, he was asked to do a bunch of different things. He did them all well. He's a high motor guy. He literally, he's good in run defense. He's good at everything. Like, right. I mean, let's start there. Kind of what big picture, what is your take on him as a prospect? And how do you view him relative to the other clear-cut number 1 edge rusher types?
The closest comp I made to him when I talked with Nate Tyson and Robert Mays about it, I said the high end is something in the neighborhood of Khalil Mack stylistically. Will he have the refinement, the full repertoire that Khalil Mack had like at his peak in Chicago? I think that's really where the argument is with him. Yeah. It's less about floor and much more about ceiling. Because like you said, the elite traits, if you're looking for that Von Miller level of like hip flexibility and bend, you're probably not going to find it in him. I would say even the best version of him, you don't really see that in his pass rush skill set, which is fine. There's a real small list of guys that can do that, which is why Von Miller is a viable pass rusher into his 30s, right? Like that's its own thing. But I think once you divorce yourself from like that elite blue chip, like no doubt Nick Bosa, Joey Bosa level of player, he falls right in the next argument, but behind those guys, behind the Myles Garretts. And I feel like you can be pretty comfortable taking him as the top edge rusher for all the reasons that you listed. You're going to get a good run defender. So it's not like, oh, this is a guy that's a project that we have to protect. We have to try to keep him away from the point of attack. He is a good speed rusher. He does have long arms. He does have good play strength. You mentioned it in his time at Alabama, and this is not just him. It's frustrating across the board when you're trying to project college guys to the NFL because the sports are just becoming more and more different as time goes on. But he's playing like true 3-4 defensive tackle, where he's like a four-eyed, like taking on the inside shoulder of a tackle in a double team on zone plays. And like those are plays that you genuinely have to throw out if you're talking about NFL projection, right? Like that's something else that can be a little bit frustrating. But if you want to take something from it, you see that explosiveness that you mentioned. You see the upper body strength. You see the way that he's able to transition speed into power. And the thing that I like about him most is the fact that the motor really never stops running. Is it going to be hand fighting like the Bosa's? No, but because he has that length, that explosiveness, and that first step, he does a really good job for a guy that's got pretty slender build wise, of dropping tackles off in quarterbacks' laps or being able to change the angle to be able to win the corner late in the pass rush. So that's kind of the thing that I'm banking on. If it doesn't work to that level, it's going to be because he's not refined and he does not have that elite pass rush skill set. So that's where the argument is, but I would be comfortable because of all the other things that he offers, especially in comparison to some of the other guys we'll get into that I think have like hard line, he's not good at this yet, hard line, he's not ready for that yet. I think Anderson is the most ready to step in and contribute immediately as an edge rusher.
Especially, well, I guess it depends on what scheme he lands in, but I'm glad you talked about the fact that Alabama, he was basically asked to line up all across the defensive line, absorb double teams.
Mm-hmm.
They used him a lot on loops and stunts, which he is, he's got good change of direction. He's very good at that.
Yes.
But if he had been, and there's some of the other guys, asked more often, almost exclusively to just pin his ears back from, the outside and go, his numbers, which are already the best in class, would have been even higher. That to me is encouraging from an upside perspective, thinking about how he might be used in the NFL, especially, I'm trying to think of I guess Houston.
Houston, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's DeMeco Ryans, so we know it's a 4-3, and he's going to be asked to line up pretty wide, and I have, pretty strong confidence in his ability to produce and get good numbers lined up that way. God, who's their second best edge rusher now?
Ooh, that is
because they let Okoronkwo go. Jerry Hughes is still there.
Jerry Hughes,
who's by the way a great guy for him to learn from.
Exactly.
He's so I think there's some upside there. I think there's obviously upside in terms of his pass rush. Right now he's kind of just like a speed to power guy for the most part, and he's just not going to embarrass you. He's really good at not being fooled by misdirection. Mm-hmm. He's a very safe pick. And
sometimes that's an unsexy thing to say when you're talking about number 2 overall potentially is safe.
Yeah.
And I'm sure that people have seen the clip from him on Good Morning Football talking about I'm not the safe pick, I'm the right pick, and that's the right thing to respond back with. But safe's not an insult in this context. Again, especially in comparison to who he's going to be stacked up against in this class. Tyree Wilson, which we'll get to in detail, he's got a poor get off, right? And he's not refined either as a pass rusher. He has some other traits that I think are interesting. But when I look at the whole, if you gave me one page just full of just boxes to check off with Anderson, he does check off, I think, the most of them in this class. If you want to see more of just him as a pure pass rusher, you'd have to go back to 2021 when he got to spend a little bit more time outside of tight ends, outside of tackles, really able to pin his ears back, especially on passing downs. And that's when you get the 31 TFLs, you get the 17 sacks, if I remember right. One of those record-breaking type of years. So I don't know if that will translate 1-to-1 to the NFL level. That would put him in that Myles Garrett type of class. But I do think at worst you're going to get a high-end starter and probably a near Pro Bowl level player more often than not if you made it a simulation.
And I'll say this, we're talking about Garrett and the Bosas, but I like him more than I liked Aiden Hutchinson last year, who was taken number 2. I mostly just because he's twitchier, his get off to me is more impressive.
Right.
And yeah, Hutchinson went too, and he had a decent rookie
He was
season.
pretty
So
decent as a
yeah,
rookie,
he looks
yeah.
good. Yeah. Okay, well, you mentioned Tyree Wilson. Let's just jump into it. I'm like, the takes are so all over the place on Wilson from people I trust.
Yes.
So he's a scary prospect to talk about for
Yes.
me, because it's not one where it's like, okay, the people I respect on this stuff feel one way. No, it's all over the place. Everybody's divided. I think so. For those who haven't watched Tyree Wilson, the number one thing you have to know is he is built like a pterodactyl.
Enormous.
He has unbelievable. I think they're longer than Giannis. We were looking it up at the combine. His wingspan is insane.
I want to say that, yeah, he's got a legitimate 7-foot wingspan,
and it shows. Frankly, he is. I mean, it's really funny too, because he's like, watching him go up against offensive tackles, like, they're build wise, like, he's as big as, I mean, he's just so big. He's super explosive. He's got crazy closing speed, and then he uses his length to his advantage. Downside is he is raw as hell. Yeah. And what's kind of funny is, despite the fact that he's raw as hell, and you kind of talked about this, he seems to be like operating on a different, like, his timing is just not there, and it's glaring.
It's like a full-on delay mechanism with getting off the
wild
ball.
I actually was trying to think of a prospect where I saw that, and I actually couldn't think of one where that jumped out to me. Despite
certainly
that,
for a guy that's like top 15, top 10, top 5 potentially,
he's still and this is what's kind of unique about him. He produced statistically. So usually, like, when we talk about guys like this, we're like, yeah, they didn't get the sacks, but they're going to come. No, he got to the quarterback. So he's at Texas Tech. So Sports Info Solutions has some fun stats. They have one called a pressure rate plus minus, which accounts for the depth of the drop, whether it's play action, alignment, and stuff like that. It's pretty cool. He finished first. More bluntly, first in pressures per game. Second in quick pressure rate, which is 2.5 seconds or less. It's another SIS stat. He ranks near the top, in the top 10 of just about every pressure statistic. So despite the fact that he doesn't really know what he's doing, and he doesn't really know what time he's supposed to get off, because he is so crazy athletic and long, he is still getting to the quarterback. Does that
encapsulates it. That you just described Tyree Wilson, like, watching some of his film, it's hilarious because of how late he can be getting off the ball based on what we expect of edge rushers. And I was like, so how does this work where I'm watching you be late, and then 2 seconds later you are dropping a tackle off, or like throwing like a Reggie White hump move to get to the quarterback? And that comes back to the physical tools, right? And I think that that's why the opinions are so disparate on him, because people just have a really hard time looking at a guy and saying, like, okay, he's got the arm length. He clearly has the long speed, even though he doesn't explode right out of his stance every time.
When he's chasing from like a backside pursuit, it is insane.
It's scary.
It's so crazy.
Terrifying.
It's so fun.
Like you said, he's basically like, he looks like what Paris Johnson Jr. would look like if he were an edge rusher. It's freakish sometimes to see the way that he wins. And then when I think about the kind of teams that really value his measurables and his skill set, I'm like, oh, this is like a dream. If you're Dennis Allen, you've got to be looking at this guy like, how could we not? Why did we trade away our future picks? We could have been here, So that's the kind of thing that I think about, is like those 4-3 teams that want those 6 techniques lined up directly over the tight end, your 9 techniques, or you're really setting the edge, and getting him in a system too. And this is, again, I feel like this carries on for so many of the guys that we're evaluating in this edge class, getting them in a system that actually allows him to really pin his ears back and go. That arm length makes up for the fact that he doesn't always have a plan, or that he might lose his initial pass rush. I see him try to set an edge or try to work an angle because of his size and just like how awkward college pockets can be. It doesn't look ideal. And then, like I said, he's just able to shove guys off, because for as long and as lanky as he is,
strong,
the strength is incredible.
When they line him up inside, they move it around some. He will just forklift guard. Like he will. I mean, he's just.
It looks like a high school highlight tape sometimes.
Yes, he's overpowering. He's also good in run defense, which is notable, right? Because he is not just a designated pass rusher. He can set an edge. Sometimes he'll get fooled, but like he definitely has the strength. Certainly, I just feel like if the biggest ding on this guy is that he's half a second late and he's still putting up these kinds of pressure numbers, why would you not want to bet on that combined with, the traits that we've been talking about? There's certainly uncertainty there, no doubt, but it's such a rare combination of speed and length. And to me, like, his issues, they seem fixable.
Right. It would be
I
one
wouldn't
thing
take
if
him
he
over
was
Anderson, but
yeah, I wouldn't either. And like it would, like you're saying, it would be one thing if he was like getting walked off the ball on running plays, right? Or it's like, okay, you just don't know what to do with your body.
Yeah.
Like we've got to build you from the ground up and understanding how to be a physical player, given your measurables. But that's not a problem. In fact, I would say that that's going to be a day one strength of his. And that's one of the reasons why I think it's a clear breakage in tiers between Will Anderson 1, Tyree Wilson 2, and then your taste for like the next 3 to 5 guys, right? And how you project them out, because he is going to be a good run defender. He does find ways to win in spite of not being a bender. And this is something that Nate Tice, my colleague, pointed out, and I 100% agree with him, because he's so huge, especially watching like him next to like Big 10 football player or Big 12 football players who are like, it feels like 9 receivers and 2 tackles basically on the field for offense. To look at a guy that huge in comparison to his peers, he has a little bit more wiggle, like a little bit more flexibility to him than you would expect for a guy who's 6'6", 6'7", and playing as high as he can sometimes.
Yeah.
So like if the thing to fix is pad level, which you can, that's like day one stuff that can get fixed. And so many guys coming into the NFL have to fix that anyways. And him being able to get off the ball, and I think going to the NFL where pass rushing is king, that's going to be another day one thing to work on with him. If I'm any team that's behind whoever picks Will Anderson, and I know that I need an edge rusher and he's available, I'm jumping for joy, because at worst I think I'm going to get a solid starter. And if he figures out anything in terms of pass rushing, I don't know how you stop a guy that has this combination of explosiveness and strength.
They need to get like not like a Simon Says device, but one of those things where you like, when you go to the eye doctor and it flashes and you have to press the button.
Yeah.
You're like, I always am worried that I'm messing that up and it means I'm gonna like get radically different prescriptions for my contact lenses. There has to be like an equivalent for that, where it's like, hey, just
the worst one for me is like the hearing test, where the beeps start getting so faint that I start like tricking myself into hearing things that I'm not.
Watch Tyree Wilson just be offsides constantly in the NFL.
Right.
He's like, okay, I'm glad we both like him, while acknowledging obviously that he is a imperfect prospect.
Yes.
I put the next 3 guys I put in a tier. This is mostly actually less like, this is just kind of me looking at a lot of mocks and seeing them kind of in the next round. So Myles Murphy, Nolan Smith, and Lukas Van Ness are all guys that I have seen sort of floating in that next region. I mean, there's guys we can talk about in a second who I think will also go first round or like are in the fringe of the first round. Will McDonald, BJ Ojulari, Keion White, who got invited to the draft. That was but Murphy, Smith, and Van Ness are the ones that I have consistently seen still in the first round.
Yes.
Different orders. I guess let's start here. What order would you take them in?
Right now, it's so, because they're different players, they fit differently in defenses, and I think some of the things that are strengths and weaknesses of theirs are just like kind of all over the place. I think I rank it like Nolan Smith first of that group, Myles Murphy second, and Lukas Van Ness third. And the distance between Murphy and Van Ness to me is like, I don't know, maybe a fingernail's worth of length, between the two. And it's because of just like how minor some of the differences are. Like when you look at Van Ness, he's extremely productive. If you look at the stats, right, his pressure rates are great. He did convert his pressures into production, right? So he is getting sacks, had a bunch of TFLs. I think he led the Big Ten in tackles for loss. And then you have to square that with the fact that he wasn't a starter. How much that matters to you kind of depends on what kind of, nitpicking you're willing to do. But the thing that was more concerning to me with Van Ness is like all of your wins are on the inside. Like, which is cool. That's a value now. You see NFL teams all the time take their 270-pound edges and just line them up over guards on second and long and third down because it's an easier pass to the quarterback. And the assumption is that an edge rusher skill set would beat a guards more often than not, and certainly would be better equipped than a 300-pound defensive tackle. Like, that's fine. There is a place for that at the next level of football. And then I'm looking and I watch him when he's on the edge. And to me, I think, and I think I wrote this, and it's not to be insulting. It's like, it would be generous to me to say that he's a project as a pass rusher when we talk about repertoire. He does not have pass rush moves.
It's not just that. He not only lacks moves, this dude is just pure bull rush.
Yes.
He lacks bend.
Right.
So it's like, okay, you need moves and you need certain athletic traits to do that. And I say that as someone who thinks he could totally be useful for NFL teams, playing on the inside, and depending on the scheme. But yeah, I mean, there's definitely some limitations there, especially when you start talking about him in the context of some of the, like a Nolan Smith, like if they're in who is clearly an edge rusher. And
exactly. We never talk about edge rushers in this context, but like you got to treat him almost like a mid first round quarterback. It's like, we're not really planning on playing this guy right now. We're going to sit him behind a veteran, let him learn what it's like to be an NFL level pass rusher. When he plays, it's going to be because either someone's hurt or we got a package for the guy where he doesn't have to think about a whole lot. And we'll just kind of let him build his own skill set from there. That's one of the reasons why I've liked like Tampa Bay for him in terms of a place to mock him to, because they obviously have a lot of value on guys that are as explosive as he is. And that's one of the things that I think can't be lost in that. He has legitimate speed, some legit agility skills, right? Like, as terms of like testing numbers, if you're setting those thresholds, all that stuff is there. It just has not translated to the football field yet. And he's pretty new to the sport. So, maybe he gets to the league and something clicks and he hits in year 2, year 3, and you might end up getting, like, by value, maybe the best edge rush pick of the class. It's just not there yet.
Yeah, I kind of skipped right to the criticisms. There are things about him, like he is...
The dude is jacked.
He is strong and he is fast, man. Yeah. Like when he does win, his closing speed is nuts combined with his power, and I think he's good in run defense too, by the way.
He's a very good run defender.
So it really is about value and place for me.
Mm-hmm. Like this is probably the most coach brain thing I'm going to say on your podcast, but like watching him block punts, I'm like, oh, there's the speed, I'm like, there's the speed. If we can get you to use that as a pass rusher, we've got something. But you can see it like on special teams where it's like, okay, and it gets back to what I was saying. On special teams, you really only got to win at one particular thing, right? You have a very particular role. So he can kind of cut loose in that way. So, maybe he's one of those guys where the NFL just suits him better long term than what we saw from him in college. But I would say that, what he is in terms of raw athlete and the lengths I think he's going to have to go to build himself to be a high-level edge rusher is why I have him third of the three that we mentioned.
Of the three, yeah. Mm-hmm. So bouncing back to the top, you had Nolan Smith first. Yep. I think Smith is an interesting one because I think he was a guy who, in his college reputation was kind of like a roller coaster, frankly, and then he was really injured last year. Yep. Coming into this draft process, I think people were like, yeah, he produced a lot in Georgia. He has some really good tape, but he's a tweener. Yeah. Then he goes and just destroys the NFL Combine.
Right.
4.3940, I believe. So he is 6'3", sorry, tweener, and 235 pounds. So it's kind of one of those things, and we're going to talk about Kancey as well, where if you're if you're small, you have to be an exceptional athlete for people to take you seriously. And Nolan Smith is an exception. And by the way, all that combine stuff, it's funny because I watched him a lot because Georgia, so this is one of those guys where it's not like, Calijah, actually, who I didn't watch in
Right.
college, frankly.
Mm-hmm.
But after the combine, I went back and watched it again, and I feel bad because it's like that. I was like kind of biasing myself, being like, "Whoa, this guy's a crazy athlete."
Right.
And it wasn't just the 40; it's a bunch of stuff. Then you go back, and it's just all over the tape.
Yes. And the funny thing is, and again, I don't want to start off with criticism, but the funny thing about the speed is like you see it in so many ways with him that's like not exactly pass rush, but it's very clearly part
Yes.
of what makes him a successful football player, right?
Yeah.
Like the ball gets out on the perimeter, and I'm like, dude, you were on the far hash. How did you beat everybody else to the ball here? This doesn't make any sense. You see him as a spy and chasing quarterbacks down. You see him drop into coverage, and this is, we've been joking around in the, quote unquote group chat that I have. Like, if this was an off-ball linebacker, I'm definitely taking this guy in the first round. When you look at his motor, the way that he takes on blocks, how physical a run defender he is, how good of a tackler he is. He's an extremely smart player. That's another thing that jumps off the film is you do not fool this guy. And if you do, you're probably only going to get one chance at it. And he's going to have you figured out after. I think that having the speed that he does, having the explosiveness that he does, makes me more willing to take a chance on that guy in that kind of 25 to 35 range. If the other pass rushers I might be in love with are off the board and I don't want to take on a project like a BJ Ojulari, who I think needs some time, I would be really comfortable with him in that range. The only issue is that it is hard to me to make a case that you can guarantee high level pass rush production from him because he's small, and being small, it's not like Hassan Reddick where he can kind of bend. He's not some elite, ghost rush move type of guy. He can turn a corner on you, and if he beats you off the ball, you're not touching the guy. Like, he is genuinely explosive, and he is genuinely flexible. So it's not that he's stiff. You just don't see the, that kind of dip and rip move where you get to shrink your surface area the way that you would like to see for a guy his size.
Yeah, a lot of his wins are just insane get off, insane bend, and the guy doesn't get hands on him.
Yeah.
And then he's just so fast. And also, I think, he's obviously lower to the ground. I think that it is, it's like, all right, well, what happens, when he has to
when it's NFL 315, not just SEC 315.
Fight back. Yeah. It's funny because he's so fast that like sometimes he overshoots, but then he's got like great change of direction, so he can flip his hips and catch quarterback when they climb the pocket, which is something I really love, that combination of the speed and the change of direction. And like you talked about him chasing dudes down. It was Bryce Young who he chased down at one point. Bryce Young, who's like my size, and 6'3" Nolan Smith just. You can even see Young thinking like, oh, I got him, right?
Yes.
Like, I'm going to hit him with a little hezzy and I'm going to turn the corner. And you can't because he's so fast. He's also like very good at run defense. If a tackle can really latch on, he can get in trouble. Yeah. But he plays so hard.
Yep.
I like him a lot. He's been a grower for me in this process a lot. I mean, I'm not going to lie, the combine really did affect me. He had a 10'8" broad job.
Like, it's sick. The numbers are sickening.
How
often
they're insane.
Do we see edge rushers run 140 and then just check out for the rest of the day? Like, that's not a position where you usually see something like that. And like you said, I mean, the run defense thing, that's the thing that I really love about the guy, is that he's not easily moved off his spot. Now, NFL tackles, dealing with outside zone from a Trent Williams, that's a different proposition. That's a lot more speed and weight on you coming your way. But the fact that he is as tough as he is, and then like you were saying, his flexibility and change of direction skills is probably going to allow him to slip by blocks. So if he plays it right, it doesn't necessarily have to be a fatal flaw of his as a run defender because the motor is so high and the football IQ is as high as it is. There are a lot of ways where he can be a very productive pass rusher, or edge defender, I should say, in general. The guy that I was thinking about was like a Leonard Floyd. You know, maybe you don't get a ton of sacks out of the guy, but you know that he plays hard as hell. He's going to set an edge for you, and he can do a bunch for your defense, right? You can run a bunch of twists and stunts with the guy.
Yeah.
You can move him around. You can drop him into coverage, and he can do so
fine.
comfortably. That would be, I think, a good role for him, and I think that his ceiling is probably higher even than what Floyd's is. So that would be the sales pitch for me if you're looking for a guy like Nolan Smith, and that's probably why I have him first in that group.
So the last guy that we're talking about in depth from the edge group is Myles Murphy, who is crazy athlete.
Yep.
Start there. So out of Clemson, by the way. Sorry, I skipped that. Also ran an incredibly fast 40.
Yep, like
he
4.51.
Crazy. Big, strong, fast. Again,
Surprisingly tiny hands, but everything else is cool.
Does he have tiny hands?
Yes, I think
didn't
he
know
has
that.
like Kenny Pickett-sized hands, like 8.5 inches or something like that.
Well, you don't really use them.
True.
And that's the biggest stink on criticism I have of him. But I mean, I guess we it's funny because like none of the edge rushers actually are really like sophisticated pass rushers.
Right.
I actually think the defensive tackles are more sophisticated to the top two we're going to talk about. Myles Murphy has a long arm. That's about it.
Yep.
Long arm and bull rush.
Long arm.
Now, let me say this: it is a strong long arm.
Yes.
He will lift you.
Yeah.
This is a team just loving I think would be a team, him going high, just loving the physical profile.
It's an archetype thing. If you're picking him
Yeah.
high, it's an archetype thing. Hey, I was talking to Nate about the same thing. I was like, look, dude, from before the time that we were born, 6'5", 270 with 34-inch arms has literally been an archetype for defensive end, like, forever. That has been the 4-3 prototypical end for as long as a 4-3 has been around. And he checks off all the boxes, and he is a legitimately explosive athlete. Like, if you gave Myles Murphy's get off to Tyree Wilson, you would probably have a Myles Garrett level of pass rusher probably, because he does get off the ball so well. That 4.51 that he ran at his pro day is legitimate when you turn on the tape and you're watching him in that way. The issue is that he is stiff as a board, right? Like, you're not going to get bend from him. You're not getting that high level of flexibility. And that he does not have a bunch of hand-fighting moves, right? He's not a guy that is going to give you your inside counters. He's not a guy that's going to set up a spin move. He's not going to have your clubs, your dips, your rips, and all of that. And it can be developed to a certain point. And because of his physical ability, I think that if it worked out, if you were able to develop any one of those kind of counter moves, it would make him a much more effective pass rusher. But the fact that he doesn't, and then you look at him, you look at the measurables, and then you go to the production side, and it's like, it's just not there. That's where it gets really hard to square. Is like, when it works, you walk away from the tape like, well, why don't you have 14 sacks? How are you not killing quarterbacks, in the ACC all the time? And I think that comes back to the lack of refinement. So that there's an argument to be made that you would probably rather have really any of these three guys as like second round prospects, but edge rushers get inflated now, and because I think this class has a legitimate drop off after this top five, you're probably going to see this guy in the late teens, early 20s at the absolute, worst, I think. So there's a way for him to be a pretty good run defender. He probably tops out as like a secondary rusher for you. And I guess you would like to have that if you have a pick late in the first round and you've got other things checked off. And we're assuming that if you're picking, you're probably a contending or near contending team in that range anyways. He's a nice guy to have. I just don't think that his ceiling would bring you what you would need back from like an elite pass rush talent.
Yeah, I threw, like I said, McDonald, Ojulari, and Keion White in this last category. Those are all guys that I've seen going first in the first round on various boards. All of them, I think, like I view them as a tier below the guys we were just talking about. Frankly, I guess of the three, Will McDonald intrigues me.
Yep.
Because the Iowa State defense is so
It's fake
silly.
football.
It's
We
a
can say
three-man
it.
front.
We can
So
say it. It's
I think
3-man fronts and 3 high safeties. It's not real football.
you watch a guy who still managed to get a decent amount of production, more so in 2021 in this defense, and who shows, I think, a lot of enticing traits, speed, flexibility. And you think, okay, well, what if I put him in like a real defense and like gave him more shots to actually get after the quarterback? He's a little bit old. He's on the older side.
Yeah.
I read somewhere. But I think of the three, he's probably the one that intrigues me the most.
Well, the funny thing to me is like I judge him on the same spectrum I judge like Nolan Smith. And it's like, well, McDonald I think is a little bit more refined as a pass rusher. Well, I think that the tape bears that out. That I think he's a little bit more skilled as a pure pass rusher. The motor is good. He is on the smaller side. Like you said, I mean, you spent a lot of time playing defensive tackle in that defense with like the lightest of light boxes, and he fought pretty hard. You're not going, I don't think you're going to get elite run defense from the guy. I don't think that's his ceiling, but he's probably serviceable. And if you miss out on a guy like Nolan Smith and you liked him, this is probably the best consolation prize that will be available in the draft. For a guy that kind of fits that mold. BJ Ojulari is interesting, but he's like a project. He's a baby to start with. Like he's like 21 years old, and I think doesn't turn 22.
So is Murphy, by the way.
Yes.
Murphy's really young.
These are really young guys. Positive. So hey, positive in the fact that there's development time. I was listening to you talk with JT, and he makes a good point. Like, hey, age is really only as important as what you actually develop out of the player. And what their ceiling actually is. Plenty of young guys come in and don't become any better than what they already are. So, you want to bank not too much on that and more on like what you think of the skill set. And Ojulari has a decent motor. There are the things that he does to win, I think translates to the NFL. He's not ready to be an NFL level run defender yet, I don't think. And I think that, he's got to add some weight to his frame to really be a legitimate edge. When you watch the way that he can get moved off his spot, the times that he might end up on the ground, right? It's like, okay, your play strength isn't exactly where it needs to be yet to be an NFL player.
It's funny contrast with the final guy, Keion White, who's
like a tank, a fire hydrant
out there. Not a lot of flexibility, not a lot of bend, but he will steamroll dudes. He is a big dude. So I think all three of these guys, it's like timeline preference. How are you going to use them? How much do you need them? All that stuff. So we'll see. I have no feel for which of them will go in the first round. But I imagine because they're edge rushers and because this class is a bit lacking, one of them probably will. So that'll be interesting to see. All right, let's take a quick break. Come back. Talk about those aforementioned defensive tackles who have better hands.
Why should you bet with Caesars Sportsbook? 2 words: Caesars Rewards. Every bet brings you closer to the types of benefits only Caesars can offer: hotel stays, VIP experiences, sports and concert tickets, and more. It's not just an app, it's an empire.
Jalen Carter. I think is the most talented player in the draft. I do want to talk about, before we get into the football side, the thing I don't like about, one of the problems I have with the Jalen Carter discourse, or one of the things that I think makes it hard to talk about him, is I think there are legitimate concerns and questions and things to talk about, and then there's the usual draft crap.
Yes.
And I think it's all getting stirred together in one pot that just has this label that says off the field. But being involved in a deadly hit and run is very different from anonymous scout saying you take plays off. And I hate the fact that this all gets smashed together into one big thing. So to me, I guess I'll start off by saying the serious stuff is totally, I understand why teams are looking into that and asking him about that and hoping he shows some accountability for that. And then there's also, bull.
Yeah, there's a lot of BS that gets swirled into that. Like you said, that's my least favorite part of the draft process, is that somehow all of that has to be taken as equally weighted data points when it's really not that way. And even with the seriousness of the deadly crash that happened with his teammates and one of the staff members for the UGA football program, I think that we probably are still talking about him a little bit less gingerly if the combination of the press availability at the combine and then the way he looked at the pro day doesn't happen. Like if you eliminate one of those two things, I think that we're probably like, okay, we'll sort out, if it doesn't rise to the level of a felony as far as like his involvement with the racing or anything like that. If they don't find him culpable for anything else and he wasn't under the influence, like, dude, that's a really dumb decision. You're going to have to answer for that. It does reflect poorly on your decision making. And that's something that you'll have to repair on your own as far as an image thing. But then to come out at the pro day and I'm like, oh, dude, you don't look like you've really been on the field since this thing happened. I'm not mad at it. Hey, I'm not mad at it.
I mean, like, if you're kind of dealing with stuff, but I think it's that. But then there was also all the smoke about like, how much does he really love football?
Care about football, yeah. Which is funny because you turn on the tape and I'm like, where are these motor issues that you guys are talking about?
Now, that said, I do think, when teams, especially when they invest high draft picks, it's not dissimilar from like hiring a CEO or like a very high profile. Mm-hmm. It's totally reasonable for them to care about things like personality.
Right.
I mean, in the same way that it matters that Nolan Smith's entire team loses their minds at everything he does. Right. He appears to be the most loved human to ever walk the halls of Georgia football. It also matters if, people like coaches, teammates, whatever, have criticisms of him. Right. Now, I think there's the distinction I want to draw is I can see why those things matter to teams, but I think it's irresponsible for me, who doesn't know jack about that, to say anything about it. So I guess that's what I want to say about the whole like off the field bucket, crime bucket.
Right.
Is I'm not disputing that those things do matter. They do matter. I just don't know about them. Exactly. So I'm not going to weigh in on them.
And I'm not in a position to act like I can change the way that I evaluate the guy because I'm not privy to the information I would need to change how I feel about him. Now, on the field, oh my God.
Let's go. All right.
Oh my God.
I think he's the most talented player in the draft.
Same. I do too. And it's like complete package as a defensive tackle, right? Like that's the part that kind of blows me away where I'm looking at this guy and it's like, oh, this is like having Ndamukong Suh in a class all over again, like think about prime Suh, when he's as explosive as he was initially in his career. He's got great hands, takes on double teams well, can play as a two-gap guy if you need him to, a genuine pass rusher, somebody who finishes on the ball. Like, you look at the type of player that can truly affect the game before he logs any stats, Carter is 100% that, and you get pass rush production out of the guy, so you don't have to take him off the field. It's
the physical traits. I'll start there because there's the physical traits and then there's the pass rush side of it. Mm-hmm. And I really believe he's a better pass rusher than like a lot of the edge rushers we were talking about. The physical side of it, I think what jumps out is just like the rare combination of things because you have a guy who's both his lower half, like he is an unmovable rock.
Yep.
Who also has overwhelming upper body strength and hands.
Yes.
That I just the sheer amount of force he's able to generate with his once he latches on, it is over.
It's over.
So you have all that, and then you couple it with the fact that he has incredible balance, which is so important at that 3-tech position, and then a rare change of direction ability combined with that strength and get off and all of it. It's such a unique and hard to find combination of physical traits, and it leaps off the tape.
And that's why I think that I can't see a version, if we're just talking about on field for Carter, that fails. You look at someone like a Calijah Kancey, right? And I think that a lot of his plays are splash plays, and that's what draws people in, is because you get to see like the avoid, the swim move, arm overs, and the slants and stuff like that.
I think some of it is, by the way, because the edge rushers all have kind of a little bit lacking, and then when you turn on his tape and you see a guy who's got like already got the swim move and stuff, you're like, oh, okay.
Right. So
Yeah.
you take what Kancey does best, and then it's like, okay, well, I'm going to add 50 pounds to that. I'm going to add like 30 pounds to that, and make this guy a really good run defender. So that's the thing is like the repertoire that he has to go with his athletic gifts, it's uncanny at that position. It's
Yeah.
really rare that you come across that. And even in a class that has several quarterbacks that we're talking about potentially going top 10, top 12, several edge rushers that can make an argument for going in the same range. It's telling to me that a defensive tackle, a 3 technique, is the best of the bunch and the one that I probably feel like, in a pinch, if I had to only pick one to be successful or be an all-pro player, it's going to be him because I just don't see many holes in his game.
The way he bounces between gaps at 310 pounds
Shouldn't happen.
wild.
It should not happen.
I mean, okay, but are there any dings? I mean, I guess I'm looking at the notes of like the games where I was like a little bit like, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I mean, let's talk about the national championship, right? I mean,
Right.
I know he was playing through injuries through some of the season.
Right.
I think what kind of more jumps out is that there were many games where offenses have clearly game planned to try to take him out of the game, whether it's through double teams running away from him. And there are games where offenses succeed at that.
Yes.
Because it's a concerted game plan to just remove him from the equation.
Right. I mean, and then that just comes down to like how much of a ding is it for you, right? Like, or, making the argument of, well, if a guy like that can be avoided, or if you can game plan your way around a guy like that, is he a number 1 overall prospect type? I think that if you take all of those and put them in their own bucket, right? That's its own thing to evaluate. How does he play when teams are running like jet sweeps and wide zones and bubble screens and everything to get the ball as far away from the box as they can and quick passes and all of that? That was a big thing with TCU too in the national championship game. Like there are times where you're watching film and you're like, all right, this is like the 6th play in a row that has ended up outside the hash. Like this is clearly by design. You guys don't want to deal with what's happening on the interior. So if you're going to complain, if people are going to hoist complaints at him because he's not getting to the ball the way that a Nolan Smith would, okay, I guess I have to take that in kind somewhat. I'll find, how you weigh that is how you weigh that. But when we're evaluating, teams are running duo, inside zone, counter right at him. How is he dealing with base blocks, with down blocks, with double teams? With teams running outside zone at him, how is he dealing with getting these stretch blocks and things like that? He has no problem handling any one of those things. And it's not like you're getting a low football IQ player. This is somebody who seems to have a pretty good understanding of his skill set, what offenses are going to try to do to him based on where he's at and how he needs to respond. And that's where the scheme versatility comes in. You might get a defensive tackle that has an elite skill set in one particular way, but he'd only work in a 4-down defense, or he'd only work in a 3-4, right? Like that can come up in conversations. But when I watch him play as a 4-eye, so he's lined up on the inside shoulder of the tackle, taking on double teams or taking on zone blocks, and he's got to play a gap and a half. When you hear NFL coaches talk about that, his tape is plenty example of that, and like you said, with striking guys and that strength, it is notable to me that all these SEC offensive linemen, every time they get struck by Jalen Carter, you see head snap back. I'm looking, chins to the sky, because when he puts his hands on you, man, you're moving off your spot. When he wants to move you, you're being moved. So you're not going to have any problems or any negatives to me on the key fundamental aspects of what would make him an effective defensive tackle. And again, this is still before we're really even talking about what he gives you as a pass rusher.
I think it's very telling. You were talking about how defensive coordinator could just say, "All right, you're gonna play gap and a half," right? Like when we were talking about all the edge rushers, we were like, okay, and maybe in this scheme, and then maybe he's maybe in a 5-man front, they could use him, they can move him inside sub package, whatever. Like Jalen Carter, I think Will Anderson you can slot him into different defenses, but Carter is unique in that, similarly to the Rams with Aaron Donald during the Super Bowl year, you can design a defense around his skill set rather than fitting him into a defense. Right. And that is pretty special and pretty unusual. There's not much else to talk about. He's clear number 1. I have Kancey as clear number 2. I guess the way I'll put it, I think the right way to frame a discussion around him is he is 6 foot flat and 280 pounds. Is he athletic enough and polished enough as a pass rusher to overcome that in the NFL? So we alluded to the pass rush moves that are all over the tape. Statistically, I mean, just the Sports Info Solutions, he finished first in pressure rate plus minus, quick pressure rate. It was 14%, just general pressure rate was first, pressures per game, TFLs per game, etc. Right? When you watch his tape, he is so quick.
Yes, flying by
the
guards.
Snap. He is just shooting gaps before anyone even has a chance. And I think, and by the way, his height helps him in some ways because it's just such a little gremlin.
Right. It is stark when you look at like the mock draftable charts or wherever you get your percentile measurables, and it's like zero. Yes, like I'm looking at the percentile, and it's like 0. Like we're not even talking like bottom 10. This is genuinely like you are one of the smallest ever to play your position. That would be an NFL player.
So. There's all these things he's really good at, but the size would be an extreme aberration.
Right.
I guess my question for you is, do you think he is good enough, athletic enough? He destroyed the combine. I don't have the numbers, but he absolutely shredded it. I don't even remember the fourth.
I think we're like a 4.67 or something like that.
Something insane.
Yeah.
So kind of like what I was saying earlier with how like if you're a tweener, it was Nolan Smith, right? You have to be so good. Calijah Kancey is so athletic, and he does. His tape is great. Does he make sense in the NFL? Like, let me rephrase that. Like, do you think is it enough to make you overcome the very legitimate concerns because of his size?
If Diante Lee is the GM of a team, I cannot turn in a card where I'm bringing in the smallest defensive tackle. I don't know if I can do that personally. And maybe that's my own like taste in what I think makes for like what works at the next level more often than not. It's such a high bar to clear. This is not the one thing I want to be clear about. Like, again, you take the helmet stickers off of it. Obviously, Aaron Donald went to Pitt too. Like, Aaron Donald is a different kind of animal for being an undersized defensive tackle, right? Like, and he has all these different ways to win, which is why his size is not an issue. You know, being shorter, being a little bit lighter than what you would typically see from defensive tackles. His repertoire is full, so he has 1,000 different ways to beat blocks, right? He can shoot gaps. He can strike guys and shed them. He can, work a move. With Kancey, so much of it, like, it feels like spamming a move like in a fighting game, like Mortal Kombat or Street Fighter or something like that. Just like, gap shoot, arm over. If a guy touches you, you're in the backfield. Cool. That's awesome. Let's see anything else. And there's really not a lot else. So having a signature move is nice. But if we're talking about having to deal with the variety of things you're going to deal with at the NFL level and the fact that NFL level guards can move too, that's where I'm like, I don't know how high we actually stack you with the rest of the defensive class.
Yeah, I think it's the value is kind of the thing, because if let's say we weren't talking about him as like a top 20 pick, let's say he was being talked about as second rounder, I'd be like, boom, Mina Kimes, GM, is running to that podium because I'm going to find ways to use him. Maybe my defensive line has some depth and he's like the final piece.
Right. Hey, maybe you kick him out to edge if you pick him like in the second round. I might give you a couple shots on the edge since you are fast,
6 foot, 280. Yeah, it's going to be one where I think the way I'll put it is this. I do think the athleticism and the pass rush success are too enticing to totally pass on.
Right.
who he plays next to is going to go a long way towards determining his success in the NFL. So I think it's just like teams being very like self-scouting and saying, okay, who do we have on this defensive line? I think that's probably why you're seeing him mocked to the Eagles so much. 10 seems rich, but because that line already has so many dudes on it, I think people think, correctly, right? Like, oh my God, him and Jordan Davis would be so funny standing next to each other.
Yeah.
Now I just want it for that.
Yes, but to me, that's the real difficulty, right? Is like how many teams just out of hand are just going to dismiss the entire notion of picking a guy like that because of where you would have to slot him into your defensive front. Like you said, if once we get outside of the conversation of the first round, you can do anything with the defensive tackle that's a speed rush, gap shoot guy on obvious passing downs. He would be a great guy to have to set up your twists and your stunts or just let him kind of tear off against a guard. There's obviously a clear pathway for him to succeed in that way. It's just like you are going to be gritting your teeth on every other play that is not like deep pocket drop back pass where he's going to be able to take advantage of his speed and athleticism.
And yet, I view him as the clear number 2 of the defensive tackles.
It's not the strongest class.
It's not that strong. You're looking at Bryan Bresee out of Clemson, who's very, very athletic. Who like, if they could just switch bodies,
yes.
It really is. He is like lacking in all of the things we just talked about with Kancey, but he's got the size. He plays hard. He does play hard.
Not the most productive. I think that in a lot of ways, you're with Bresee, you're probably drafting the idea of Bresee more than you are the player that you're going to get right in the door. But he's one of those kind of jack of all trades, master of nones on the defensive interior. Like probably nice to have in your rotation, but also probably not going to be a high level producer for you.
Myles Smith is interesting for me out of Michigan. If you're just looking for like a true nose, and you play, it depends on the type of defense. But if you're, at one of those too high defenses, I could see him being a useful player. But I pass rush is
not gonna get. It's not there.
Yeah.
Keanu Benton is, kind of interesting. He's another kind of jack of all trades type. Pretty agile for a guy his size. Doesn't have the most play strength in the world. You're going to have questions about what kind of run defender you're getting in him and whether or not what he gives you as a pass rusher would justify what you might be giving up at run defense. So, like you said, there's just a lot up in the air with like the non-Carter guys on the defensive interior.